Montana Territory, January 1879, the wind came down from the mountains like a blade, sharp and constant, pulling at the edges of the land with long, frozen fingers. Snow had been falling for 2 days straight, turning the world to quiet. Jacob Kessler pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse down the narrow trail through the pines, the sky a pale gray blur above him. He had left his cabin just after dawn to check the upper fence line, but something in his gut had made him detour along the creek. That was when he saw her. A woman bareheaded, her dress soaked through, and a baby clutched tight against her chest sat half buried in a snowbank near the bend, her arms curled around the child like she could block out the storm with her own body. She was crying, but the sound was so small it barely rose above the wind. Jacob dismounted fast, his boots crunching through the ice as he knelt beside her. "Ma'am," his voice was low, careful. "Can you hear me?" The woman blinked up at him, her face blotched with cold. "Please," she said, hoarse. "She's only a baby, please." He looked down at the bundle in her arms. The infant was swaddled in a thin shawl, her face red and raw from the cold, but she was breathing, alive. He looked back at the woman and said without thinking, "I got room for both of you." Tears ran fresh down her cheeks, but she nodded. "Thank you." Jacob took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then lifted the baby into his arms with slow, steady hands. "What's her name?" The woman tried to speak, her lips shaking too hard to form the words. She swallowed, then said, "Sadie." "All right then, Sadie," Jacob said softly. "Let's get you both home." He helped the woman to her feet and got her onto the horse, then handed Sadie back to her mother once she was steady. Jacob led the horse through the snow, walking beside them the whole way back to his cabin, which sat tucked against a low ridge, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the fire was strong and the room warm. Jacob laid a heavy quilt by the hearth, guiding the woman down onto it. She clutched Sadie to her chest, rocking her softly while her body trembled. Jacob crouched beside them. "I'll get you something dry," he said. "And food, you'll both be all right." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. He brought her his sister's old clothes from the trunk in the attic, worn but clean, and a basin of warm water. He stepped outside to give her privacy, then came back in when he heard Sadie's soft cry fill the cabin. The woman had changed into the dry clothes and was sitting near the fire, her dark hair hanging wet around her face. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw the woman beneath the frost young, maybe 20 or 21, with a quiet strength in her eyes that had not gone out, even if it had dimmed. "I am Jacob Kessler," he said gently, setting down a plate of cornbread and beans beside her. She hesitated, then said, "Louisa Penner, and this is Sadie." He gave a small nod, then knelt again to stoke the fire. "You got people nearby?" Louisa shook her head. "No, where were you headed?" "I do not know anymore," she said quietly. "I was trying to reach Bozeman. But the wagon broke down 2 days ago. The man who drove it left us. I waited, then started walking." Jacob's jaw clenched. "You were walking 2 days, in this cold?" She nodded once, her eyes steady. He looked at Sadie, then back at Louisa. "Well, you are here now, you are safe. That is what matters." Louisa lowered her head, clutching Sadie tighter. "I thought I was going to die out there." Jacob sat on the floor across from her. "You are not going to die, you are going to rest, eat. And when the snow clears, we will figure out what comes next." Louisa glanced up then, and her eyes lingered on his face. "Why did you help me?" He shrugged. "Because I could." Then, quieter, "Because no one should be left in the snow with a baby." The fire snapped softly between them. Sadie had drifted off, her tiny mouth slack in sleep. Louisa shifted, resting her cheek against the top of her daughter's head. Jacob stood and walked to the stove. "You can have the bed, I will sleep in the chair." "I could take the chair," Louisa offered, but he shook his head. "You need the rest more than I do." That night, Jacob sat by the fire with a blanket over his legs, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Louisa lay curled in his bed, Sadie tucked safely beside her. He watched the slow rise and fall of their breathing, and some part of him settled in a way it had not in years. In the morning, the storm had passed. The world outside glittered white and still. Jacob made coffee, the smell warm and sharp in the air, and watched as Louisa stirred under the quilts. She blinked up at him, her hair tangled, her eyes soft with sleep. Good morning, he said. Louisa sat up slowly, cradling Sadie. It is real, I thought I dreamed it. No dream, Jacob said. You are here. Something flickered across her face, then relief maybe, or the first hint of trust. She looked at him a long moment. Thank you for saving us. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck and looked down. You do not have to thank me. I am just glad I found you when I did. Louisa stood, holding Sadie close, and stepped toward him. You gave us a place. That means more than you know. Jacob met her eyes, and something passed between them, quiet but certain. He cleared his throat. There is still plenty of snow to shovel if you feel up to it. Louisa actually smiled, the first real one he had seen from her. I think I do. They stepped out into the cold together, the sun just beginning to rise over the ridge. The air was crisp, the world bright, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like something good was just beginning. By the third day, the snow had settled into heavy drifts that leaned against the cabin walls like old men too tired to stand. Louisa stood at the edge of the woodshed, gathering kindling with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her cheeks pink from the cold. Jacob watched from across the yard as she worked deliberate and unhurried, the baby wrapped against her chest in a sling fashioned from a cut-up flour sack. She didn't ask for help. She hadn't asked for much of anything. Inside, Jacob had warmed a skillet over the stove and set bread dough to rise beneath a flour sack cloth. It wasn't until he heard her boots on the porch that he looked up. You stacked it all neat, he said, nodding toward the bundle of wood in her arms. Didn't expect you to split kindling. I saw the axe and figured it wasn't just for show, she replied, brushing snow off her skirt with the back of her wrist. Besides, you've been hauling water and keeping the fire going near constant. I'm not made of glass. Jacob offered a small nod, then stepped aside so she could pass. The baby stirred faintly beneath the sling, her tiny fingers curling near Louisa's collarbone. She's quiet today, he said. She always quiets down when I'm working. Louisa paused, her eyes flicking to the stove. You're baking. Trying to. She set the wood down in the corner and crossed to the hearth, crouching low beside it. Her hand rested lightly over Sadie's back, her movements gentle but sure. Jacob leaned against the doorframe. You ever bake much? Louisa didn't look up. Once. Back when I worked for the Fenleys outside of Leavenworth, the wife had a sourdough jar she guarded like it was gold. I learned to make biscuits from her, though mine always came out flatter. You worked as a maid, cook and laundry mostly, until she got sick and they sent the children off to her sister. She stood then, brushing her palms on her skirt. That's where I met Sadie's father. He was a field hand. Jacob's eyes stayed on her. You still carry his name? No, she answered, steady. He left before she was born. Said he'd send for us, but I stopped waiting when the first winter passed and didn't hear a word. Jacob didn't speak for a moment, then reached for the skillet and turned it gently. The scent of browning butter filled the room, warm and familiar. I can take her for a bit, he said. If you want to rest your back. Louisa hesitated, her arms tightening slightly around the baby. I'll sit right here, he added. You can have a minute to breathe. She studied him with a measuring kind of quiet, then nodded once and loosened the sling, lifting Sadie into his arms. The infant's eyes fluttered open, one brief, glassy glance before she sighed and curled against Jacob's chest. Louisa sank onto the bench by the table, her fingers resting in her lap. She doesn't like loud rooms, she said after a while, or unfamiliar hands, but she doesn't cry much. Just watches. Jacob shifted the baby a little higher, careful of her head. She's got good weight on her, considering. I traded sewing for milk back in Helena. Stayed with a widow for 3 weeks while her son was getting over a fever. She let me sleep in the barn. You sew? Louisa nodded. Enough to patch, mend, and make dresses that don't fall apart. Then you're already more useful than most men I've hired come spring, Jacob said. That earned a faint smile from her, not wide, but real. You thinking of putting me to work? I'm thinking you don't seem like the type to take charity. She didn't answer that. Outside, the wind had gone still, and the sound of dripping snow from the eaves filled the silence. Jacob looked down at the child, whose breath was warm against the wool of his shirt. You've done right by her. Louisa's gaze dropped to her hands. I didn't know if I would. Some mornings I'd wake up certain I'd lost her, just from the cold or hunger or because I wasn't enough. But she'd always be there, blinking up at me. like she already knew we'd keep going. Jacob didn't speak, just shifted Sadie once more and looked into the fire. When the bread was done, they ate in quiet, broken only by Sadie's soft noises and the clink of utensils against tin plates. Afterward, Louisa stood and began gathering the dishes without being asked. "I'll do that," Jacob said, rising from his chair. "I've got it." She turned her head toward him, her voice low but sure. "I'm not looking to be waited on. I just needed a place to stop running." Jacob held her gaze. "You found one." She nodded once, then turned back to the basin. The sleeves of her borrowed blouse rolled to her elbows again. Her arms moved with a kind of practiced rhythm, like she was making each motion count. Jacob watched her a moment longer, then stepped outside into the cold, his breath frosting in front of him. The sun was slipping lower behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the yard. He leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, and listened to the faint clatter of dishware and the soft hum of a woman singing something low and wordless from inside. He didn't think of what might happen after the thaw. He didn't think of what he owed or what she might choose. In that moment, he only knew they were warm, fed, and still standing. And that, for now, was enough. The snow began to melt slowly, not with any sudden warmth, but with long trickles from the roof and soft patches of wet earth showing between the drifts. Jacob had taken to mending the tack in the lean-to behind the cabin, oiling the cracked leather straps and checking buckles for rust. Louisa had started sowing onion seed in the small window box, humming low under her breath as she pressed the soft soil with her thumbs. One morning, while Sadie napped wrapped snug in the sling across her chest, she stood in the kitchen with her hair tied up and sleeves damp to the elbows. Jacob came in from the barn with hay clinging to his coat, and a look in his eye like something had turned over in him during the walk. "I saw a wagon trail," he said, brushing snow from his cuffs. "Ruts headed toward the Old Creek Ford. Must have come through late last night." Louisa's hands stilled over the dough she'd been kneading. "Anyone you recognized?" "No." "Two horses, no markings on the wheels." He crossed to the stove and poured a dipperful of water. "Could be a trapper or someone headed west before the thaw turns the roads to mud." She nodded, returning to her work. "I don't like not knowing who's out there." "Neither do I." Jacob set the dipper down. "You want me to ride out, circle back behind the ridge?" Louisa looked up then, her gaze quiet but firm. "Only if you think it's needed." "I trust your judgment." He didn't answer right away, just watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist. "I'll wait till morning. If they come closer, we'll know." That night, Jacob brought in the saddle blanket and laid it near the fire to dry. Louisa sat with her legs folded beneath her, Sadie asleep in a woven basket nearby. The flames danced across her face as she stitched a patch into the hem of one of his work shirts. "You've got steady hands," he said. Louisa didn't look up. "My last needle snapped yesterday." "This one's dull. I've got a spare in the cellar in Ma's old tin." She set the shirt aside and leaned back against the chair leg. "You keep a lot of her things," Jacob nodded. "Some. She died before I came west, but I packed what I could carry." Louisa reached for the basket and adjusted the blanket over Sadie's legs. "My mother passed when I was 16. I buried her behind the church in Clay County. Never thought I'd be the one left. She teach you to sew. She taught me to keep my hands busy when my mind wasn't fit to be alone." Jacob sat down across from her, stretching his legs toward the fire. "I used to think quiet meant something was missing. Now I think it's the only way to hear what matters." Louisa glanced over at him. "And what is it you hear?" He met her eyes, and the silence between them lengthened, deeper than before. "Not sure I've got the words for it yet," he said. Outside, the wind had gone still again. No animals stirred, and not even the trees creaked. Louisa leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees, her voice softer than before. "When Sadie came, I wanted to believe I could build something better for her, but I didn't know where to start. I just kept moving." "You didn't stop," Jacob said. "That's what matters." "I was afraid if I did, the world would close in." He looked at her a long moment. "And now," she let the question settle, then said, "Now I'm not so afraid. I'm still figuring the rest." Jacob stood and crossed to the stove, lifting the kettle and pouring 2 tin cups with hot water steeped in dried mint. He brought one to her without a word. Louisa wrapped her hands around the cup and breathed in the warmth. "I never pictured myself in Montana." When I was a girl, I thought I'd live in Kansas forever. You still could if that's what you want. She shook her head once. No, I've had enough of looking back. Jacob sat beside her. Then we'll look forward. She didn't speak, but her hand brushed lightly against his as she reached for her needle again. He didn't pull away. The fire burned low, and the baby stirred once in her sleep, then settled. Louisa leaned her head against the chair and exhaled slowly. Jacob watched her for a while, then said, "There's a small spring behind the far pasture. Come thaw, I'll show you." A pause, then her voice came, soft as a breath. "I'd like that." He stayed there beside her until the last of the fire turned to embers. Neither of them moved, as if the stillness itself had become something shared. By late February, the ground had begun to soften in places, and a thin mist sometimes rose from the creek in the early mornings. Jacob stood at the edge of the pasture before sunrise, watching the mare nudge at the frozen grass with her nose. The days were gaining light, but the cold still bit through wool before the sun turned the snow to slush by afternoon. Inside the cabin, Louisa had just finished nursing Sadie. She shifted the baby onto her shoulder and gently rubbed her back, standing near the stove where the warmth settled deepest. The bread from the day before sat cooling on the shelf, dense and cracked but good enough to last them 2 days if they rationed it. When Jacob returned, he carried a wrapped bundle under one arm and a coil of wire in the other. He set both down by the door and unbuttoned his coat, shaking off the damp. "I passed the old trapper's tree on the way back," he said, hanging his hat on the peg. "Someone's been leaving snares again." Too close to the ridge trail. Louisa bent to lay Sadie in the cradle, tucking the quilt around her legs. "Do you think it's the same wagon you saw last week?" "No tracks this time," he said. "Just the wire and some fresh cut branches." "Whoever it is, they're staying quiet." She straightened slowly, her face unreadable. "We should keep to the cabin for a few days." Jacob nodded. "I'll check the line at first light. If they're still close, I'll deal with it." Louisa crossed to the table and unwrapped a cloth bundle dried apples she'd soaked in warm water before adding them to the morning's oats. "I could make Sadie a new shift," she said after a moment. "She's outgrowing the ones I brought. I'll ride into Livingston next week," Jacob said. "Supplies are getting low and I can pick up some muslin." She glanced up from the pot. "You trust me here alone?" "I do." They ate in silence for a while, the sound of the spoon scraping the sides of the pot the only thing between them. When Sadie whimpered in her sleep, Louisa rose and crouched beside the cradle, her fingers brushing lightly over the baby's brow. Jacob studied her there, the line of her shoulder, the way she touched the child with a care that seemed to come from something deeper than instinct. He stood and crossed to the hearth, crouching to add another log. "You said you worked for the Fenleys," he said. "Ever think of starting something of your own?" Louisa stayed kneeling beside Sadie. "A seamstress in town offered to take me on once, said I had a good hand but I couldn't read patterns. I was 16, never got the chance to learn. You could learn now." She looked over at him, uncertain. "You think there's call for it out here?" "There's always call for someone who knows how to make things last." Louisa's face softened, not quite a smile but something near it. "Then maybe I will." Jacob leaned back on his heels. "You could set up in the lean-to come spring. Let in the light, hang cloth from the rafters. Wouldn't take much." She rose and returned to the table, rinsing the pot in the basin. "You planning on keeping us?" He stood slowly. "I never said you had to leave." Louisa dried her hands on the cloth and turned toward him. "And if I wanted to stay?" His jaw worked for a moment, but he held her gaze. "Then I'd be grateful." The space between them felt full, not with anything heavy, but with something slow-moving and sure. Louisa stepped closer, her voice quiet. "Jacob, I'm not looking for someone to carry me." "I wouldn't ask you to be carried," he said. "Only to walk beside me." Outside, the wind shifted. Louisa looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I've never had a place where I was wanted without owing something." "You don't owe me," he said. "Not a thing." Her breath caught, just a little. Then she nodded and stepped back to the cradle, brushing Sadie's cheek with the back of her finger. That night, as the wind settled and the world held still beneath a sky full of stars, Jacob stayed awake longer than usual. Louisa had gone to bed with Sadie curled against her side, the child's breath soft and even. He sat near the hearth, sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes, but his eyes kept drifting toward the bed. The fire cast a faint glow across the quilts, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a place to hide from the world. It felt like something built on purpose. He set the knife down and leaned back in the chair, his thoughts quiet. When he finally let his eyes close, it was with the knowledge that come morning, whatever they built would be theirs and no one else's. The road to Livingston was rutted and half-thawed, but Jacob made the ride and returned 2 days later with a saddlebag full of muslin, a spool of strong thread, and a small tin of horehound drops he hadn't meant to buy until he passed the mercantile window and remembered the way Sadie's cough had rasped once during the night. He rode back slow, careful of the soft patches along the ridge trail, the weight of what waited at home heavier than the supplies. He found Louisa kneeling in the root cellar, sorting sprouting potatoes from firm ones. She looked up at the sound of boots on the ladder. "You're back early," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Road held better than I thought." He set the muslin down on the shelf beside her. "Got you the cloth and something for Sadie, too." She reached for the fabric first, fingers running along the edge. "This is good weave," she said softly. "Thank you." Jacob handed her the tin next, for her cough, just in case. Louisa turned the tin over in her hands, then looked up at him. "You think of everything, don't you?" "I try," he said. They walked back to the cabin together, and Jacob noticed how her stride had changed. She no longer held herself like someone waiting to be turned away. She moved like the land belonged to her, same as the wind or the light coming through the spruce trees. That evening, she laid the muslin flat across the table and began cutting a pattern with her sewing shears. Jacob sat nearby, running a whetstone over his drawknife while Sadie lay on a folded quilt near the hearth, cooing softly. Louisa paused mid-cut. "You ever think about building out the back of the cabin?" He looked up. "You mean adding on? There's room. Could fit 2 more beds and still have space to move." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'd thought about it, but never had reason to." "You do now," she said, not looking up from her work. He set the knife aside. "You mean to stay then?" Louisa laid the cut piece down and met his eyes. "I've been thinking on it, and I don't want to keep waiting for the next place or the next man to be different. Sadie deserves roots. And I want to plant them here." Jacob stood and crossed the room in 3 steps. He kept his hands at his sides, but his voice was steady. "I've wanted to ask you, but I didn't want to press you, not after everything you've come through." "I know," she said. "That's part of why I trust you." He reached out then, slow, and she didn't pull away, his fingers wrapped gently around hers. "I've got land," he said. "I've got a name that holds steady, and I've got room for you both, not just in the house, but in whatever comes next." She stepped closer. "I won't be quiet. I've got opinions, and I'll want a say in how we raise her." "I wouldn't want anything less," he said. She smiled, real and wide this time, and slipped her hand up to rest against his chest. "Then I'd like to be your wife, Jacob Kessler. If you'll have me." "I've been waiting for you longer than I knew," he said. They married under a clear sky 3 weeks later, with the last of the snow melting in the gullies and the creek running high from the thaw. Jacob wore his best coat and trimmed his beard with a straight razor Louisa had sharpened for him. She wore a dress she stitched herself from the muslin. She added a strip of hand-embroidered trim to the hem, and Jacob told her it was the finest thing he'd ever seen. They said their vows before the preacher in Livingston, standing just outside the church beneath a budding cottonwood. Sadie was in Louisa's arms, wide-eyed and rosy-cheeked, wrapped in a new swaddle Jacob had bartered for from a fur trader's wife. Afterward, they rode back to the homestead, the wagon full of supplies and the sky streaked with the gold of early spring. Jacob added the new room before the first planting. He built it by hand, 1 board at a time, with Louisa steadying beams and holding the level while Sadie napped in the shade. They filled it with a 2nd bed, a low cradle, and a shelf for her sewing things. There was a window that looked west, where the sun dipped low behind the trees each evening. Louisa took up mending for ranchers and dressmaking for women in the valley. Her name spread quiet and fast, and she kept her work careful and fair. Jacob planted wheat that year, and by harvest, the field rolled like gold in the wind. Sadie learned to walk just as the leaves began to turn. She toddled between them with arms outstretched and a laugh that cracked open the quiet. Jacob built her a stool from pine scraps, and Louisa painted a single blue flower on the seat. They lived that way, steady, rooted, and whole. Love did not come in declarations, but in the way Jacob always left the lantern burning for Louisa if she worked late, and in the way she pressed a hand to his shoulder before dawn when he rose to check the pasture. They shared the work, the silence, and the small joys. The first egg laid in spring, the sound of rain on the roof, the feel of Sadie's fingers curled around theirs in sleep. And in the years that followed, through winters and thaws, through births and seasons and quiet mornings, they remained together, unshaken and home at last.